Hi, my name is Tom Shannon. I'm a technical artist here at Epic Games. Today, we're going to be looking at the Visual Data Prep system in Unreal Engine. Visual Data Prep allows us to create reusable workflows or recipes that we can use to merge, manage, and clean up our data before it's even imported into our project. We will be looking at a couple of examples of how we can use this using some AEC data. We will also look at how we can reuse these workflows by exposing parameters and creating instances of them. And then finally, we'll look at how we can use blueprints to actually create custom nodes that we can use within our recipes. All right, let's get started. We have a boring topic to cover today, I'm afraid. Data prep. As we know, not only is it boring, it's also quite error prone. And, really, it takes time away from doing the things that we really want to do and need to do, which is telling stories and bringing our visions and our clients' visions to life. So, of course, we lean on automation as we always have. It lets us save time, it improves our accuracy and our delivery times and our quality. And of course, we have to because CAD data is not real-time ready. It needs to be processed to get the best quality and performance from your scene. Processing can include doing things like replacing materials, renaming objects, and collapsing them. And, typically, in the past, I've relied on another application outside of my CAD application in Unreal to do a lot of that data preparation, because by the time that data gets into Unreal, if it's not optimized, it can cause a lot of problems. So that's not ideal. It would be way better if I didn't have to have that middleman, so to speak, and could do it directly in Unreal. So I could go straight from my design application, my CAD application, right into Unreal and process that data directly in there. So as Unreal has grown up from being just a game engine and is now a general purpose real-time engine, its abilities to automate workflows have grown as well. So you can use commandlets, which are C++ applications that you can write that can run outside the editor, that can process content within the content editor, and even do some limited work within levels. Those are quite hard to create and require C++ knowledge and some pretty good knowledge of our engine. More recently, we've added in-editor scripting capabilities to the engine, where you can use Blueprint or Python to create tools within Unreal Engine to do all sorts of either data preparation or pipeline sorts of operations. All of these kind of have the same problem. They all work on existing imported content. You have to import everything that you need, all of your data, before you can start processing it. And of course, that leads to our content browser being full of textures and materials and even models that we're still not using in our scene. So we end up with kind of a really messy content browser. And overall, it can just end up starting to get really disorganized. What if we could, one, do it all within Unreal Engine and do all of this sort of data prep before we even add it into our project? Well, that's what we thought that we could do. And what we've come up with is called Visual Data Prep. So Visual Data Prep is a tool that lives in Unreal Engine, and it allows you to batch import CAD data from Datasmith or from CAD files. It lets you do things like tessellation, merging objects, creating LODs, creating collision, all of those things that you would normally have to do either manually or with a Python or Blueprint script, you can now do as part of the import process. At a high level, the way this works is First, we pre-import the CAD file into the tool, so then we can see what the world will look like and what materials will be created, what actors will be added to the world, and what the hierarchy will be. And then we can build and execute a data prep recipe that can take that original data and modify it so that it works better in Unreal Engine, looks better, etc. Once we've run that recipe, we actually, within the tool, can preview it with both a 3D preview, a 3D viewport of the data, and also a preview of the content browser results and the scene results. And then finally, when we're happy with everything, we commit it. And this is when it actually gets added to your project. So up until we hit the commit button, none of this data is added to our project. So if we're not happy with it, we're not stuck cleaning up a huge import of all of our design data. All right, let's get started. To begin working with Visual Data Prep, first we need to enable the plugin. Let's go up here to Plugins. On the left, we'll find Data Prep, and then just ensure that the Data Prep editor is turned on. You may have to restart your editor. Once you do restart your editor, you can now create a data prep asset type in the content browser. I'm creating one here and I'll call it my data prep. And we'll open it up. This is the data prep recipe editor. Here we can build a recipe down here from our building blocks in this palette on the left. We have a viewport and some preview panes up here. And up here we can control our inputs. So let's start by defining our file to import. As you can see, we can import both individual files, folders. We can also have a mix of files, a list of files, folders, whatever. We're just going to do a file import for now. I'm going to choose this Datasmith file that was exported from Revit. And when I click open, you can see it just assigns it to the file path here. Before it appears anywhere in the editor, first I must import it. Now that our data is imported, we can begin working on it. But first, let's see what's happened here. Here we can look into our viewport here and see our 3D preview of our model. We can fly around, move around as we would expect in an Unreal Engine scene. On the left here, this shows us all of the assets, all of the meshes, all of the materials and textures that will be imported. On the right here, we have a preview of all of the actors that will be placed in the level and their hierarchy. So you can get an idea of how your data looks, how it will be stored on disk, and how it will be structured in your level. Let's build our first recipe now. Let's do something simple. In our scene, I know that there is an RPC actor. Let's find them by clicking on them, and then I'll hit F. Let me right over to them. Very convenient. And I want to replace this RPC actor with a mesh from my library. So to do this, the first thing I need to do is I need to filter out all of these actors and find just this one. And we have a lot of ways to filter, but one of the most powerful ones is using the metadata value. So let's go ahead and just drag one over into the data recipe. And as soon as we do, we create our first column here. And here we can filter the metadata of this actor. And when we import data from CAD files, we often get this metadata. And to figure out what metadata is in this actor, we can select it. And over here we have our details panel. And as you can see, it's much like the details panel of an actor in the editor, but we can't edit anything. Everything's been grayed out. We can just look into it. So we can look and see what metadata is in here. And you can see that Datasmith brought in quite a bit of data, including element information. And the thing that's going to be helpful for us is the element family here, which is mRPC mail. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that to save myself some time. I'm going to paste it here, and the element is element family. Now to make sure I got this right, I'm going to right-click and preview the filter. And what that does is it put a little check mark next to any actors that fit this description. And as I fly by, you can see, there we are. Our entourage is right there, and it's got the little check mark. So we know that our filter is finding the right thing. I'm going to go ahead and clear that filter. And now what I want to do is, on this static mesh actor, I basically want to set the mesh on it. And we have a block right here, and we just drag it right here to add a step in this process. And so now, for all of the meshes that or all the actors that it finds that have this tag, this metadata, it will perform this operation. In this case, we want to replace it with Emmet here. Great. So now we will find all of the RPC mail actors and replace them with Emmet here. Now to do this, to actually run this, we click the execute. Execute actually processes this recipe here. So you can see execute completed, and it's almost exactly what we want, but Emmet is facing maybe the wrong way. So let's go ahead and add another step to this so we can turn Emmet around. We're going to do that with the random offset transform, which seems a little weird, but stick with me here. We're going to set the transform type to rotate, and then we're going to set the minimum and the maximum both to 180 degrees, which will be less than random. We will pretty much just turn 180 degrees. And again, we'll click execute to see what happens. Great. And now, as you can see, Emmet is facing the way we would expect, already making some improvements. Now let's talk about materials. Replacing materials is a really common thing to do when we're bringing in our assets. Datasmith does bring in materials from CAD applications, but typically those materials are not the prettiest materials available. You probably have a whole library of really nice materials that you've already created, and you'd prefer to use those. That's really easy to do. We have a couple of nodes that can help with this. The first one is simply substitute material. Substitute material searches anything that you pass into it, in this case the entire scene, and it looks for a search, and when it matches it, it'll replace it. For example, let's replace this wood floor. I'm going to click the wood floor. I'm going to take a look and see that the material I want to replace is called wood flooring. So we'll say wood flooring. And we want to replace that with this nice parquet material that we've got. Let's go ahead and click execute and see how that works. Now, as you can see, our floor material has been replaced with a much nicer looking material. Now there's a lot more materials that we need to replace here. We've got glass and metal and this concrete, etc. And so we could, of course, just go and keep adding more and more of these substitute materials in here. And that works pretty well, but it's not real reusable. If we ever wanted to make another data prep recipe with that same material replacement stack, we'd have to copy paste or whatever, and it could be a little funky. So what we can do is we can lean on another Unreal Engine feature called data tables so that we can build an asset that will inform our material replacement system what to do. Let's take a look at that real quick. It's really easy to build one of these data tables from your content browser. You just right click and you go to miscellaneous, and right here is data table. And then select the row structure of material substitution data table. And we will call this my material table, I suppose. When we open it up, this is the editor, and we can just add a row. And you can see down here, we can edit the row, and it's very much like what we were just working with. We can say wood flooring, and of course, we can march through all of the different materials. We could do glass, etc., and replace those with glass as we see fit. Now I'm going to take a bit of a shortcut, and I've already built a data table here that you can see is a little more robust. I've got plastic, aluminum brick, and there's a basketball court in here too that I've even gone and replaced some stuff with. So let's see how we can use this back in our data prep. So I'm going to get rid of substitute material and instead use substitute material by table. And in this case, it's just going to ask for my data table, and I can just choose that data table we just looked at. And now when I hit execute, now all of my materials have been replaced by the materials I selected in my my data table. You can see I've got nice glass, much nicer brick, much nicer concrete. Already this model's looking much, much better. So now my model's improved, and I want to bring this into my scene. The last thing I have to do is simply to say commit. Now when I do, it will take the process data and actually add it to the content browser. Now once it's done, we can come back to our main editor, and here we go. Our data is in the editor, looking really nice, ready to start working with, start building our scene around. I want you to notice that when it imported, it created a Datasmith scene. And this is really important because design data is not static. Assuredly, through the life cycle of this project, this data will change, and we are keenly aware of that. And so data prep is tied into Datasmith. In fact, your Datasmith scene understands and knows that the data prep asset was used to prepare this data. So if you ever re-import your Datasmith scene, by clicking Update Datasmith Scene, it will actually process the data prep asset as part of that. It is completely integrated into Datasmith. But once you apply the data prep, you don't have to worry about in the future knowing which one you used, etc. It's all ready for you. All right, now that we've looked at creating data prep assets, building recipes, and importing content into our project, let's take a look at how we can reuse these data prep assets. These recipes can become really sophisticated and complicated. And also, as we work in Unreal, we'll realize that many of our workflows between projects are very similar. And it would be really useful if we could reuse these data prep assets without having to re-edit them. To accomplish this, we took a page out of our material editor and created data prep instances. Much like in the material editor, we use parameters to expose variables within the asset that our instances can override. Let's look at creating one real quick. I'm going to open up the data prep asset, and I want to create variations of this data prep asset that maybe have different material data tables. So in this case, rather than having the material data table be a constant, I can simply right-click, say link to parameter, and I can create a new parameter right here. I'm going to go ahead and save. Go back to my content browser. Now when I right-click on my data prep asset, I can create an instance of it. Let's call this my data prep materials 2. And now when I open it, you'll see much like the material instance editor, we no longer have access to our graph, just the basic outline. But in this case, we can easily change our material data table to any material data table we want and rerun the recipe and get a different result. Almost all inputs within your asset can be tied to a parameter. So the sky's really the limit on how you want to customize your workflows. Visual data prep is really powerful, and we've provided some of the most common data prep filters and operators. These should work for a vast majority of your needs, but we know that we could never create all the filters and operators everyone needs. So we've exposed the ability to create new filters and operators using blueprints. In this example, I'm going to create a blueprint that will replace meshes with one of an array of meshes. So to create this, we simply create a new blueprint class, and from our classes dropdown, we look for data prep. And here we can choose a fetcher, which is one of our filters, or an operation, which is what I really want to make. So let's call this BP random mesh. Now when I open it up, it looks a lot like a standard blueprint editor with some stuff stripped out, because that kind of is. What I need to do is I need to override the onExecution function. This is the function that runs when the data prep recipe is run. I'm going to break the context to get access to the objects, and I'm going to loop through them. I'm going to do a for each loop. I'm going to cast them to static mesh actors. And in there, I am going to set their mesh. Set the static mesh. Bring this up. And then what mesh do I want to put in there? Well, let's create a variable. Let's call this meshes. Let's set it as a static mesh. Static mesh. Let's set that to be an array. And then let's do some quick array magic. We're going to get the length of the array. Then we're going to get a random integer from that array. And then we are going to get a copy from that array. So this little bit of code right here will just return a random member from that meshes array. And we will drop that into new mesh. And that's it. That's all we have to do. Now for every mesh it executes, it will randomly select one of these. Oh, I will actually have to set meshes to be instance editable so that it shows up in our interface. Go ahead and hit compile and save. When we come back to our Visual Data Prep editor, we'll see down here in the operators, we have some user-defined ones. If I drag BP random mesh in here, and we can get rid of set mesh. We can now add an array of various actors. That's right, we can randomly replace our RPZs with tables. So as you can see, it's really easy to extend Visual Data Prep to fit your workflow and do the things that you need. Data prep is boring. It still is, but at least now you can spend a little less time doing the data prep and enjoy the benefits of automation without ever having to leave the comforts of the Unreal Editor. Thank you. Have a great day.